And welcome back to Coaching with the Bible. This week's episode is episode 123, season 3, episode 14. Our portion of the week is the portion known as Va'era, the second portion in the second book of the 5 books of Moses, of the book of Exodus. Episode 123. Our topic this week, on when the boss is a dictator. Sort of the title is different than I usually do it, but I had this sort of mindset, focus, interest this week on, I'm not even sure you can call them a second level character in the story. More often than not, they are an afterthought at best, except for maybe one or two appearances. But I wanted to zoom in for a minute on the wise men, the sages, the magicians in the court of Pharaoh. One of the benefits, let's say, of reviewing a text year over year for long periods of time, really getting in depth in all of the verses and all the paragraphs and all the words and all the meanings, is that you then have an opportunity to study the less obvious parts, the more subtle interactions and goings on, and you can distill all kinds of interesting, I think, lessons, ideas, thoughts, structures, strategies, tips from those things as well. And one of those that is super interesting to me is the role that the wise men, the advisory committee, and the magicians in the court of Pharaoh play. And what sort of spurred my thinking was imagining the first and second and third meeting between Pharaoh and Moses, and not looking at it from the perspective of Pharaoh or Moses, but looking at it through the eyes of someone else who is in the room. A magician. And what's interesting about the court of Pharaoh, as described in the Bible, is that there is no question who the leader and who the power and who the authority is. That is the king of Egypt, that is the Pharaoh. There's no question that who the protagonist or perhaps antagonist is in the story, and that's Moses. But they're not the only people who are there. You have this group of magicians who are present in the court of Pharaoh. And so I was curious about seeing the meetings and seeing the room from the perspective of these people, and then maybe projecting or cutting and pasting or implanting from there into our own work environments or into our own situations when we're dealing with someone who's, let's say, exceptionally difficult. In some cases, the person you answer to at work. A dictator of sorts. The boss. And what's also spurred my mind for that kind of thing, we have no idea. We can't get there. But we can speculate about it. What spurred my mind was the book by Malcolm Gladwell called What the Dog Saw. What the Dog Saw is a collection of Gladwell's articles over the course of many years at the New Yorker. And in the preface, in the introduction, he talks about all the different articles you're about to see and why to a degree, why they're there. And he's talking about someone by the name of Cesar Millan, who was known as a dog whisperer. And so the article was about how this person was able to calm the most dangerous and angriest of dogs and other animals. And he was focused in on What's going on inside the mind of this person as he's doing that? That was the inspiration, Gladwell writes. But then I'll quote the end of this paragraph. But after I got halfway through my reporting, I realized there was an even better question. When Milan performs his magic, what goes on inside the dog's mind? That's what we really want to know, what the dog saw. So I'm not comparing the magicians in the court of Pharaoh to dogs. But as always is the case, and we see this very often now in a lot of books, that books are written from multiple perspectives. You have the main character, you have a secondary character, and you see the same story from different lenses throughout. It's fascinating. Two people can witness the same event and see it completely differently. And so I wondered, what did the magicians see when Moses came into the room? And what is their ability, if any, to say anything to Pharaoh in those moments? And the reason I bring it up is because what's going on there is obviously, it's a power play, but there are a lot of lives at stake here. The lives of all the people of Israel, the lives of all the Egyptians. There's a lot at stake in these meetings, conversations, decisions, emotions, personalities, temperaments, all these things. And if you're standing in the room and it's starting to go south, can you say something to Pharaoh? Can you open your mouth? There's a heavy burden and a heavy risk. At the same time, if you're Pharaoh, you're all powerful. Can you take advice from people? Can you listen to what they have to say and implement and act upon their insights? It's like a large question. If you're the person, the wise man, the magician, do you put your life at risk to say something, or you do not say anything? You sort of just go on with your business and watch Egypt crumble because Pharaoh is too stubborn and can't listen and can't reason and can't adapt as a leader here for the circumstance and the situation. Maybe you want to yell and scream at Pharaoh at certain moments while you're standing there and you can't, or maybe you can. And so I thought this whole sort of dynamic was super interesting. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But as you watch the story unfold, starting at the beginning of the book of Exodus, and as it progresses through the redemption and the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt, you see these people appear in the story and then disappear in the story. They play the role of magician. They match the plagues performed by Moses and Aaron. And at the same time, they are a bit of a sounding board to Pharaoh. And at the same time, they're also then discarded and diminished and effectively removed from the scene as it progresses, spoiler alert, into the end of the different plagues, when really at the end, the last plague, it's just Pharaoh and Moses. They bring Moses back, but the story itself in those rooms, those people are no longer there. So it's an interesting sort of play. It's an interesting sort of role play. It's an interesting sort of conversation that's happening in Egypt, in this court, and what they're doing there. The most obvious circumstance and situation, I'm spending a lot of time on this part of it, admittedly, because I think it's super interesting, is in the third plague. The third plague is the plague of lice. And there, at that point, the jig is up because the magicians can't perform and match the wizardry, quote unquote, of Aaron. They can't keep up. And there they say, it's the finger of God. It's quite a statement in the court of Pharaoh to Pharaoh directly to say, we cannot compete, we cannot perform that act. That is not natural, that is an act of God, that's a statement of a revolution. It's a rebellion, because that flies in the face of who Pharaoh is. But they say it. Got to be consequences for making a statement like that. I can't imagine you make a statement like that so easily and get away with it so simply and go home at night. Imagine the scene. Moses shows up. They perform these acts. You're a magician in the court. You come home at night. Your family asks you, how was work today? And you talk about this unbelievably inspirational person who is not your leader, but the leader or the one who's looking to take the other people out of your land. Like, how does that go down? So I find this fascinating. I find it interesting. And in the context of how we think here at Coaching with the Bible, it sort of spurred some thinking about what happens when you work for a dictator. What happens when you have a boss who is exceedingly difficult? Obviously, you don't want to be in that kind of toxic situation, or you don't sign up for that kind of toxic situation. But we all know, or perhaps we have been, in a situation like that. We're working for someone or with someone. We're answering to someone. We're accountable to someone who is difficult. Quote unquote, a dictator. And so there's a lot of research and a lot of literature around the subject of what's called managing up or leading up. We talked about it once. We talked about Abraham trying to convince God to let the people of Sodom and Gomorrah live, and how you persuade up. But here, let's take it out of the space of God and put it into the space of us. And what do we do in those situations when we have to manage a boss? We have to work a situation. We can't leave that work environment. Let's say we get paid very well, or it's a good setup for the family that you have. So leaving isn't so simple. It would be quite precarious to step away from something like that. So you have to live and breathe and deal inside of that space on a regular basis. How do you do that? So I have this awesome little book. It's about 100 pages. It's called Managing Your Boss. It's a business guide from Barron's. And it's some great chapters. What kind of animal is the boss? How do you impress your boss? Dealing with the boss from hell. Common problems in managing the boss. I mean, it's awesome. It's like a really good little book. A lot of great tips. Some really hilarious little cartoons in the book. But it goes through all kinds of scenarios and situations about how do you do a better job of managing that kind of effectively impossible situation. And here I'm talking about accountability situations that are vertical levels, vertical types of accountability. I mentioned that actually in the first Coaching with the Bible on accountability, dealing with Adam and Eve and the sin there with the apple and the tree. There are different kinds of accountability in terms of the relationships involved. There's vertical accountability and there's horizontal accountability. Horizontal accountability would be known more as what you would call peer-to-peer accountability, where it's collegial, it's teammates, it's people at the same level on a team, it's siblings, let's say, who can see eye to eye, and so the relationship is horizontal, and so their accountability level is horizontal. It's a very powerful and very meaningful way, and it's an optimal way, really, of building a team and setting a team in motion, is building very powerful peer-to-peer accountability. At the same time, there's also vertical accountability, is when there's someone above you. That's the God, servant relationship. That is the, dictator, slave relationship. That is the boss to an employee, employer to employee. That is very often a vertical accountability structure. And that's when it gets complicated, because it's not something that you control. It's not something, that you lead. It's not something that you have the upper hand in. You are, by definition, below that person on some level. So what do you do? So the first thing to do here, according to all the different leadership, is to make an assessment of, as the managing your boss says, what kind of animal is the boss? Meaning, who am I working for? Not just how do I do it, but first, who is this person? What's the personality of this person? So is this person a dictator? They tell you what to do. They don't listen to what you have to say. Their ego overwhelms the room. They have power, want to be in charge. They'll blame all kinds of things on other people. That's one. There's a micromanager. I think we all know what that one is. That's a different kind of boss that we deal with. There's the, what we'll call, what's in an article in Forbes called the inadequate one. It's the one where no one understands how that person got the position that they have. Their years of experience, their level of knowledge, their success do not in any way, reason warrant them being there, but yet they're there. And how do you work with someone who is that poorly qualified for a position? There are all kinds of quote unquote animals that exist in terms of the boss space. And you have to sort of think about what might be the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, or what possible strategies I can use to employ and use in those situations to put myself in the best possible position to A, stay employed, B, continue to make that salary, and C, avoid the wrath or the dysfunction of that person. There are other kinds as well, the procrastinator, the idiot, the abuser. These are all kinds of bosses that exist. And as I said, obviously, no one should want to, or no one should have to be in such a circumstance and work in such an environment. It's not good for the soul to sort of be that way. But, as I said before, it is the case for a lot of us. I'm going a little bit long, but I do want to sort of understand this. So when you're looking at a case like Pharoah, so obviously Pharoah is a dictator, and so there's not even a question about that. And so you have to think about, okay, now once I know what kind of boss it is, how do I operate in that environment? What am I doing first to get that to sort of workable? So first I want to think about some survival tactics, things that I can do that, put me in a position to really succeed. For example, bosses like that, maybe they have inadequacy issues, or maybe they worry about loyalty, or maybe they had issues in another environment. Now they're taking it out on people that they work with now, their employees. And so you have to sort of keep your head in the right space from a loyalty perspective with someone like this, because that person is always checking and always concerned and always worried about the loyalty of their employees. And so cross-channel conversation or cross-team conversation that you might be having with a friend who's on a different team or a manager on a different team, they're going to look at with high levels of distrust and high levels of disloyalty. And so what you want to do there as a survival tactic is make it abundantly clear and state it over and over and over again that those conversations are very much about creating an environment that's best for customers, and it's cross-work related and not anything more than that. And that it's totally normal. And so it sort of puts it out there, becomes part of the culture of the room. Perhaps you want to lean into the dictator's craziness in the dictator's world. You maybe want to become an advisor in that room. Maybe the best way to survive in Egypt was to be a magician or an advisor in the court of Pharaoh. And so maybe sometimes, instead of avoiding the dictator, avoiding that difficult person, you lean into it and you try to offer counsel. You become a trusted advisor of that person, with the one caveat that you're mindful and careful about the kind of counsel, the style of counsel that you're providing, because then you need to really do what was written in one of the articles I saw today, was to run a regular systems check on your values. When you're in that position and you're working with someone like that and you're in effectively some sort of a survival mode or you're always on edge and you're always on your toes and it's eggshells all the time, you are risking making a mistake and you are risking violating your own ethics. And so you have to check in there. Preferably, probably with somebody outside the company. Just to sort of, walk it through, review, check your tactics, check your conscience, check your methods, check your ethics, that kind of thing. Going back to the loyalty idea, something additional which I thought was a really good way to sort of think about it. And a lot of these great articles on leadership and these issues here on leadership, a lot of the thinking comes out of military work, and it's applicable in a lot of different environments. So one article I read talked about the idea that with respect to somebody who you're working with who operates this way, this was the rule. Always salute the flag before you disagree with your commanding officer. So in the military, you're always saluting the flag first before you disagree with your commanding officer. The implication, the idea here is that A, you're on the same side, you're on the same team. It also means that you're showing the level of respect for their role. You don't have to like the person, but you have to have respect for the general. And so by operating in that manner, you're setting a tone, you're setting a direction. In managing your boss, it talks about how you enter a room, how you hold yourself, how you present your work. All those things are in respect, personally self-respect, but also in respect of the position of the person who's around you. And so you have to operate in that manner. So again, we talked about some survival tactics here, and now we're talking about a very specific way of how you're implementing when you have to have difficult conversations with a boss who doesn't like criticism, who doesn't take criticism, who likes to turn the table, point the finger, take the credit, avoid the blame, all that other stuff. So if you have to have a hard conversation, you have to prepare for a hard conversation. And so to plan out, think through the questions and the answers that you want to ask and the answers that you may perhaps need, and how do you manage and direct the conversation into the zone that you want to be without it becoming disrespectful or, again, dangerous for you. But be prepared for the conversation and maybe even admit openly at the start of the conversation with that person, I'm a little uncomfortable having this kind of a conversation. I'm a little nervous about this discussion. And so you want them to know that a little bit you're sweating, you're a little bit stressed, a little bit of anxiety around what you're trying to do here. It acknowledges their power, it puts them in the power position, but it also gives you some room to talk a little bit wider and be maybe a little less careful than you maybe have to be in that room because you're acknowledging the discomfort. Number 2 is an appreciation that this person more than likely has their own version of facts about what happened or didn't happen, what resulted or what didn't result, what success or success didn't exist. And so you have to stay curious in that space to learn what exactly is it that they saw, they heard in that moment, and then ask the right questions. How can I help you be successful so that we can achieve X or Y or Z? What's the next step regarding this situation? So you're staying curious, but you're asking the right questions. It's directing the conversation into the space and into the ones that you want. And then, of course, in this place, in this zone, having the hard conversation and setting a regularity to these hard conversations, as hard as that is, and that's hard, that cadence is very powerful for you in managing the moment, in managing the boss. So you're going to have that initial conversation. You're going to ask the right questions. You're going to get some action items. You're going to follow through. You're not going to lead on to anything about how you feel, how you think about the person, as to who they are. You're going to have high levels of accountability both to yourself and to the work. Then you're going to follow up and do it again. I know it sounds sort of masochistic. I can't even get the word out. It's a little crazy, but it works. And that's how you sort of set that up. We live in an environment where people don't want to be accountable, where people just want to be heard, and they want to be successful, and they want credit, and they want to do. And so we have to be really appreciative of what accountability means and how accountability impacts the people around us. And so to end this week, again, appreciate that you as the boss, if you can create an environment where you are making yourself accountable and you're creating a level of accountability, that you're creating an environment of, you want to call it radical transparency in the same way that Reed Dalio does at Bridgewater, fine. But anything that makes you more accountable, that provides an environment and a culture where people can share their comments and their critiques openly and freely, will create better teams and greater success. That's also true. But appreciate the following with the last quote. This quote comes from somebody named Vishwas Chavan. Vishwas Chavan is a spiritual thinker and leader. And he said as follows: accountability and self-responsibility are critical to our success in personal, professional, and public life. However, we often look for those character traits in others rather than inculcating them in ourselves. We don't want to be Pharaoh in the court of Pharaoh. We don't want to find ourselves in a position to be the number 2s and number 3s in toxic environments. Ideally, we want to be out of those places. But reality tells us that we sometimes are going to be that person. And the question then becomes, is how do we operate in that space, in that time, in those moments? That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. I went a little bit long. I appreciate your indulgence. I thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you next week here again, Coaching with the Bible.